Practical Anarchy, A Guide to Self-Determination, Dickie Dredd. Section 11. Everyday Anarchies before 1900. It wasn't just philosophers and pamphlets. Ordinary life carried anarchist streaks too. Workers' associations sprung up, often running on principles of direct democracy. Early cooperatives, communal experiments and radical unions hinted at a world beyond the state. In Spain, and that'll be in the next section, rural communities with traditions of local autonomy were fertile ground. In Switzerland and Italy, federations of workers debated direct action. In Russia, peasant communities, the Mir, kept alive practices of collective land management. Across the Atlantic, indigenous communities resisted centralised impositions. Similar traditions of self-rule existed in Northern Europe, where Frisian freedom maintained peasant assemblies and collective governance outside of feudal authority. By the 18th century, elites had a handy word for popular action: the mob. Whether it was Londoners tearing down brothels on Shrove Tuesday, crowds storming Newgate Prison in the Gordon riots of 1780, or women marching to demand fair bread prices, the same sneer applied: mob rule, chaos, anarchy. But historians later revealed the opposite. Thompson showed that food riots were often carefully organised. People seized grain, sold it at what they called a just price, and handed the money back to the merchant. No random looting, but a community enforcing its own moral economy. Machine breakers, the so-called Luddites, didn't smash at random either. They targeted specific frames and owners who undercut wages. From the perspective of the gentry, this was dangerous lawlessness. From below, it was collective bargaining by riot. Without unions or ballots, the crowd was the tool people had. It was messy, noisy, sometimes violent, but it followed its own rules. And those rules were often more about fairness than chaos. Stop that. Sorry, cat's destroying the sofa. The mob showed that ordinary people didn't need parliaments or police to enforce justice. They made their own decisions in the square, the tavern, the factory floor. To rulers that looked like anarchy. To participants it was order of a different kind. These everyday practices showed that anarchism wasn't just theory, it was lived. Whether in workers' halls, peasants' villages or squatted land, people were already experimenting with life beyond rulers. Spain, the seedbed of anarchism. No country took anarchism to heart quite like Spain. By the end of the 19th century, it was already the beating heart of the movement. That didn't happen by accident. It grew from soil already rich in communal traditions and deep mistrust of authority. Spanish peasants had long memories. The Comunero revolts of the 16th century and the stubborn independence of rural villages left behind a culture of local self-rule. Many communities shared land through usos comunales, collective grazing, forests and irrigation systems managed by neighbours rather than distant officials. When anarchist pamphlets arrived, peasants didn't see them as wild foreign theory. They recognised something that looked a lot like their own traditions. The state in Spain, meanwhile, was often seen as predatory and absent at the same time. Taxes were high, officials corrupt, and in many rural areas, Madrid felt very far away. In the state's own face was soldiers and tax collectors. No wonder peasants warmed to the idea that society could do better without rulers. The workers aside, just as important. In the 1860s, the First International brought anarchist organisers into Spanish cities. Buchanan's International Alliance had a significant influence, stressing direct action and workers' self-organisation rather than parliamentary games. Spanish workers found the message far more inspiring than waiting for politicians to act. By the 1870s and 1880s, anarchist federations and societies had spread through Andalusia and Catalonia and beyond. They organised strikes, schools, reading groups. Some turned to propaganda by the deed. Spectacular actions meant to shake society awake. Others built steady underground networks of solidarity. What made Spain unique wasn't just theory but scale. Anarchism wasn't a fringe sect, it was a mass current among peasants and workers. By 1900, the foundations were laid for what would become the greatest anarchist experiment of the 20th century. The collectives and militias of 1936 didn't spring from nowhere. They grew from decades of villages and unions already living anarchism in practice. Section 12, Chapter Conclusion. The roots are deep. By 1900, anarchism had grown from an insult into a movement with flesh and blood. It carried the weight of centuries, Taoist sages and Greek cynics, medieval heretics and peasant rebels, Enlightenment philosophers and firebrand revolutionaries. It was no longer just a whisper at the margins, but a force discussed in congresses, feared in parliaments, and lived in villages, factories and streets. The Industrial Revolution gave it its sharpest teeth. Machines and slums, showing the cruelty of wage slavery, while workers' strikes and co-ops hinted at alternatives. The French Revolution taught both the power of crowds and the danger of centralisation. The Paris Commune showed, if only for weeks, that an entire city could run itself from below. In America, constitutions promised liberty, while slavery and massacres exposed the state's true face. Yet runaways, rebels and Thoreau sketched different visions of freedom. Anarchism wasn't just political theory, it was social, spiritual and personal. Bakunin thundered against God, while Tolstoy tried to make Christianity anarchist. Women like Wollstonecraft, Tristan, Michel and Claremont faced the question, what use is a revolution if half of humanity is left in chains? By the end of the century, anarchism had become international, carried in pamphlets and songs, strikes and schools across Europe, the Americas and beyond. It also carried a darker reputation. Propaganda by the deed, bombs, pistols, assassinations, made headlines and gave rulers excuses to crush movements. Yet behind the noise, anarchists kept building the quieter structures, unions, federations, free schools, co-ops, the everyday networks that would nourish future struggles. The roots of anarchism were tangled, spiritual fire and militant rage, theory and practice, co-ops and conspiracies, but they were deep. By 1900, anarchism had showed again and again that ordinary people could live without masters. The 20th century would bring revolutions, repression and resilience. But that is the next story for the next chapter.